Some ghosts don't haunt houses. They haunt engines. The rain fell on the city of glass and steel not as a cleansing force, but as an annoyance. It beaded on the windows of penthouse suites and slid down the sides of luxury cars, a minor inconvenience to men who measured their lives in market shares and acquisitions. For Alastair Finch, the rain was a personal affront. It mirrored the chaotic, sputtering rhythm that had taken hold of the one thing in his life that was meant to be perfect. His 1961 Rolls Royce Phantom V. The car wasn't merely a vehicle. It was an heirloom, a monument of obsidian black and polished chrome that whispered tales of old money and unimpeachable power. It had belonged to his father, a man of quiet brilliance, and now it belonged to Alastair, a man of loud success. But for the past 3 weeks, the Phantom had been sick. A subtle, intermittent misfire, a ghost in its magnificent V8 engine that no one could diagnose. The official Rolls Royce service center, with its sterile bays and technicians in crisp white coats, had been useless. They spoke of replacing the entire ignition system, a suggestion Alastair found as vulgar as putting a digital watch on a marble statue. Independent specialists, men with lofty reputations and even loftier bills, had tinkered and tested and shrugged. The ghost remained. Alastair sat in his corner office. The city spread beneath him like a circuit board, his jaw tight. His empire was built on precision, on identifying and eliminating inefficiencies. This was an inefficiency he couldn't eliminate. It was a flaw in his otherwise flawless world. His assistant, a young man named Peterson who was perpetually terrified, cleared his throat. "Sir," Peterson began, his voice barely a whisper, "I made one more call. It's unconventional." Alastair didn't look up from his tablet. "If it's another European specialist who needs to be flown in, forget it. I'm not paying for another 5-star failure. No, sir. He's local, or rather, on the outskirts. A man named Silas." The name was simple, unadorned. It lacked the reassuring European flourish Alastair associated with quality. Silas, and his qualifications? Peterson hesitated, a fatal sign. "He doesn't have a website, sir. No advertising. It's just a name that comes up in certain circles. They say he doesn't fix cars. They say he understands them." Alastair scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Oh, a car whisperer. How poetic. Where is this guru's ashram located?" Peterson swallowed, consulting his notes as if they might offer him a shield. "It's a workshop. In the Ironwood district." Alastair's head snapped up. The Ironwood district was a part of the city he only flew over. It was a place of brick warehouses, rust-stained fences, and forgotten industries. The idea of taking his father's Phantom there was, in a word, repulsive. It was like taking a duchess to a dockside tavern. "You're telling me," he said, his voice dangerously low, "that the solution to my multi-million-dollar, vintage Rolls-Royce problem is in a back-alley garage in the grimmiest part of the city?" "They say he's the only one left who can handle problems like this, sir," Peterson stammered. "The old ones. The ones with souls." Alastair stared out the window, his reflection a mask of supreme irritation. Soul? What a ridiculous notion. It was an engine, a machine. But desperation was a powerful acid, capable of dissolving even the most stubborn pride. He had exhausted the world of the polished and the professional. All that was left was the unconventional. "Get the address," he commanded, the words tasting like ash, "and have the Phantom trailered. I'm not having it break down in that part of town." 2 hours later, Alastair's chauffeured sedan, a modern and soulless machine, navigated the cracked streets of the Ironwood district. The gleaming towers of the city center were a distant, hazy memory. Here, the buildings were squat and functional, bearing the scars of time and neglect. The trailer carrying the Phantom followed like a royal barge navigating a polluted canal. The address led them not to a gleaming workshop, but to a large, unassuming brick building with a faded sign that simply read, S. Croft Engineering. There was no auto, no repair, no service, just the name and the discipline. Alastair stepped out of his car, his handmade Italian shoes landing on oil-stained pavement. He wrinkled his nose at the smell, a potent cocktail of hot metal, solvent, and old rain. He looked at the garage. The large bay door was rolled halfway up, revealing a space cloaked in shadow, a stark contrast to the bright, sterile environments he was used to. He could hear the soft hiss of a pneumatic tool from within. With a sigh of profound regret, he ducked under the door and stepped inside. The interior was cavernous and surprisingly organized. Tools, gleaming with use, hung on pegboards in perfect, silhouetted rows. Engine blocks set on stands like sculptures, their intricate inner workings exposed. There was no clutter, only purpose. And in the center of the room, illuminated by a single, low-hanging work light, a man was bent over the open engine bay of a vintage muscle car. He was a tall man, lean, but with the dense, weary strength of someone who worked with their hands every day. He wore simple, dark blue overalls over a gray t-shirt. His hair was cut short, flecked with gray at the temples. His skin was the color of rich, dark coffee. He didn't look up. He didn't seem to have noticed Alistair's arrival at all. His focus was absolute, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace inside the engine. This was Silas. Alistair cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the vastness of the space. The man didn't flinch. Alistair, unaccustomed to being ignored, felt a prickle of his earlier annoyance return, now sharpened with prejudice. He saw a black man in a dirty garage, and his mind, a machine honed for snap judgments and brutal efficiency, made 1,000 dismissive calculations. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with the authority he used on his board of directors. "I'm looking for Silas." The man straightened up slowly. He turned, not with a start, but with a controlled pivot, as if he'd been aware of Alistair's presence all along. He wiped his hands on a clean red rag, his movements unhurried. His face was a study in stillness. His eyes, dark and intelligent, held a deep-seated calm that was almost unnerving. They met Alistair's, and for a moment, Alistair felt strangely scrutinized, as if his expensive suit and arrogant posture were being weighed and found wanting. The man simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head. He didn't speak. "Right," Alistair said, feeling off balance. "I was told you might be able to help with my car." He gestured vaguely toward the entrance, where the trailer was now being positioned. Silas's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to Alistair. Still, he said nothing. His silence was a wall. It wasn't hostile, nor was it subservient. It was something else entirely. It was neutral, absolute. It forced Alistair to fill the void, to keep talking, to justify his own presence. "It's a 1961 Phantom V," Alistair continued, the words feeling boastful and foolish in the quiet garage. "There's an intermittent misfire. The best mechanics in the city have looked at it. No one can find it." Silas held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the bay door. He rolled it up completely, the chains rattling in the silence. The gray, rainy daylight flooded in, illuminating the magnificent, somber form of the Rolls Royce as it was slowly backed off the trailer. The car, even covered in a light sheen of road grime from its journey, was breathtaking. It commanded the space. Silas walked a slow circle around the Phantom. He didn't touch it. He just looked. His eyes traced the long, flowing lines of the body, the proud grille, the iconic spirit of ecstasy ornament on the hood. He was not looking at it like a mechanic assessing a job. He was looking at it like a historian examining a relic, or a doctor observing a patient. Alistair watched, a knot of impatience tightening in his stomach. He wanted diagnostics, technical jargon, plan of action. He was getting a silent, meditative stroll. "Well," Alistair finally snapped, his patience gone. "Can you fix it or not? I don't have time for this." Silas stopped his circuit and stood by the driver's side door. He looked from the car to Alistair, and his expression held a flicker of something Alistair couldn't decipher. It might have been pity, or perhaps it was disappointment. He raised a single hand and gestured toward the ignition, a silent request for the keys. Alistair hesitated, then produced the heavy, ornate key. He didn't hand it to Silas. He placed it on the fender of the car, a small unconscious act of separation, of not wanting to make direct contact. Silas picked up the key, his calloused fingers closing around it. He opened the heavy door, the click of the latch echoing in the garage, and slid into the driver's seat. The worn leather sighed under his weight. Alistair bristled, an irrational sense of violation washing over him. That was his seat. His father's seat. Inside. Silas did not immediately start the engine. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, a massive, thin-rimmed circle of bakelite. He closed his eyes, and for a full minute, he just sat there, perfectly still. Alistair stared, dumbfounded. Was this some kind of ritual? A prayer? The entire situation was becoming more absurd by the second. He was about to order his men to load the car back onto the trailer. When Silas's eyes opened, he turned the key. The engine turned over, a deep, basso profundo rumble that was almost perfect. Almost. After a few seconds, it happened. A slight tremor, a subtle cough, lost to an untrained ear. But to Alistair, who had spent weeks obsessing over it, it was as loud as a gunshot. There it is. Silas didn't rev the engine. He didn't connect any diagnostic machines. He simply listened, his head cocked slightly. He let the engine idle for another minute, his expression unreadable, before a young man, no older than 19, appeared from a back room. He had the eager, slightly greasy look of an apprentice. "Boss?" he asked. Silas turned the engine off. The silence that rushed back in felt heavier than before. He looked at the young man, and then gestured toward the front of the Rolls. It was the first time Alistair saw him give a clear instruction, and it was done without a single word. The apprentice, who Alistair would later learn was named Leo, immediately understood. He grabbed a set of tools and a creeper. Silas got out of the car, walked to the front, and lifted the massive, side-hinged hood. He propped it open and stood there, staring down into the engine bay. The V8 was a masterpiece of mid-century engineering, a complex world of wires, hoses, and polished metal. To Alistair, it was an unsolvable puzzle. To Silas, it seemed to be an open book. For the next 4 hours, Alistair Finch, a man whose time was billed in thousands of dollars per hour, did something he had never done before. He waited. He stood. He paced. He sat on an overturned crate. Growing increasingly agitated, Silas and his apprentice worked in near total silence. The only sounds were the soft clink of metal on metal, the whisper of a wrench turning, the occasional grunt of effort. Silas moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There were no wasted steps, no fumbled tools. His hands, which Alistair had initially seen as simply grimy, were now revealed to be instruments of incredible precision. They moved through the labyrinthine engine bay with the confidence of a surgeon navigating a familiar anatomy. Alistair watched as Silas bypassed the obvious. He didn't check the spark plugs or the distributor cap, the first things every other mechanic had done. Instead, he seemed to be tracing the wiring loom, his fingers gently probing the decades-old, fabric-wrapped wires. He would stop, close his eyes, and just feel, as if he could sense the flow of electricity through his skin. At one point, Alistair couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Have you found anything?" he demanded. "You've been at it for hours. I need an update." Silas didn't look up. It was Leo, the apprentice, who answered, his voice quiet and respectful. "He's listening, sir. He says these old cars talk. You just have to be quiet enough to hear them." Alistair almost laughed. Listening, talking, the sheer unadulterated nonsense of it. "It's a machine, young man. It doesn't talk. It functions, or it malfunctions. It's binary." Leo just shook his head slightly and went back to handing Silas the tools he requested, again, without a single word being exchanged. A silent communion. Alistair felt like an outsider, a loud, obnoxious tourist in a sacred place. The feeling was deeply unsettling. He was used to being the center of any room he entered. Here, he was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the car and the silent man who was tending to it. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the garage floor, Silas finally stopped. He had traced a single wire from the firewall deep into the bowels of the engine. He pointed to a specific spot, where the wire passed through a metal clamp, almost invisible against the engine block. He gestured for a small inspection mirror and a light. Leo provided them instantly. Silas angled the mirror, shining the light onto it. He motioned for Alistair to come closer. Reluctantly, Alistair leaned over the fender, the smell of engine oil and metal filling his nostrils. He peered at the mirror. On the underside of the wire, where it was pressed against the sharp edge of the clamp, was a tiny, almost imperceptible chafe. The fabric casing was worn through, and a single, hair-thin strand of copper was exposed. When the engine vibrated, at a certain frequency, it would ground itself against the clamp for a millisecond, creating the phantom misfire, before the vibration shifted it away again. It was a 1 in a million fault, hidden from sight, undetectable by any standard diagnostic tool. It could only be found by someone who had the patience to trace every single inch of the system by hand, by someone who was willing to listen. Alistair stared, speechless. For weeks, teams of so-called experts, with all their computerized equipment, had been stumped. This man, in his silent, methodical way, had found it in a matter of hours. Silas went to a workbench and returned with a small piece of heat-shrink tubing and a roll of period-correct fabric wiring tape. He didn't replace the wire, which would have been anachronistic. He repaired it, his movements delicate and precise. He insulated the tiny break, secured it, and then wrapped the section of the loom so that the repair was virtually invisible, a perfect match to the rest of the engine bay. It was the work of an artist, a preservationist. When he was finished, he wiped his hands and stood back from the car. He looked at Alistair and nodded once. The silent signal was clear. It is done. Alistair felt a wave of relief so profound, it almost made him dizzy. But it was quickly followed by his habitual arrogance. The man had done his job. A difficult job, to be sure, but a job nonetheless. It was time to settle the bill and leave this dreary place behind. Excellent, Alistair said, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone. He reached for his wallet, a sleek, black leather accessory that probably cost more than the tools Silas used. What do I owe you for your time? Silas did not look at the wallet. He simply looked at Alistair, his gaze steady. Then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, with the texture as rich as the engine's purr he had just restored. Your father, Silas said, the words hanging in the air. He never liked to rush a job. He said a car like this one has a memory. You have to respect it. Alistair froze, his hand hovering over his wallet. The blood drained from his face. What did you just say? Silas walked over to a large, old-fashioned wooden toolbox that sat in a corner of the garage. It was a beautiful, dovetailed chest, clearly a cherished item. He opened the top drawer and took something out. Arthur Finch was a great engineer, Silas continued, his voice even, but he was a better man. He taught me that the most important tool in any workshop isn't a wrench or a voltmeter. It's patience. Alistair's mind was reeling. His father's name, Arthur, spoken with such familiarity in this place, by this man. It was impossible. His father had moved in circles of academics and executives, not mechanics in the Ironwood district. Silas turned back toward him. In his hand was a small, dog-eared photograph, its corners softened by time. He held it out for Alistair to see. The photo was black and white. In it, a much younger Alistair's father, Arthur Finch, stood beaming with pride next to the very same Rolls Royce Phantom looking brand new. And next to him, with his hand on the engine, was a young man in his early 20s. A brilliant, smiling young black man. It was Silas. Alistair felt the world tilt on its axis. The air was punched from his lungs. The photograph was a key, unlocking a torrent of forgotten memories. His father, talking for hours about his protege, a young genius from the City College engineering program he had taken under his wing. That boy, Silas, his father used to say, his eyes shining. He doesn't just see the machine, Alistair. He sees the poetry in it. He has the gift. He'll go further than any of us. Alistair had been young, arrogant, already chasing the allure of finance and corporate conquest. He had dismissed his father's words, seeing them as the sentimental ramblings of an old man who preferred gears and pistons to profit margins. He had never bothered to ask for the protégé's last name. He had never cared enough to meet him. In his mind, his father's protégé was an abstract concept, not a person. And certainly not this person. He brought the car here, right? After he bought it, Silas said, his voice soft now, tinged with memory. We spent a whole weekend just taking things apart and putting them back together, just to understand it. He said, Silas, one day my son will have this car. I hope he cherishes the craftsmanship as much as I do. He gave me this photo, said it was to remember the start of a beautiful friendship. Alistair looked from the photograph to the man standing before him. He saw it all now, with sickening clarity. The silent appraisal when he had first walked in, the flicker of disappointment in Silas's eyes, the profound, quiet dignity. It wasn't the silence of a subordinate. It was the silence of a judge. Silas had known who he was from the moment he'd stepped into the garage. He had watched Alistair, the son of his mentor, behave with a condescending arrogance that would have broken his father's heart. He had let Alistair's prejudice hang in the air, allowing him to expose the full, ugly measure of his character. The reverse humiliation was absolute. It wasn't a loud dressing down. It was a quiet, devastating revelation. Alistair's entire sense of self, built on the foundation of his success and his lineage, crumbled into dust. He wasn't the proud heir to his father's legacy. He was a disgrace to it. He had stood in the presence of the one man his father had admired as a true peer, and he had treated him like a hired hand, like something he'd stepped on. The shame was a physical force, a crushing weight on his chest. He thought of his father's gentle nature, his respect for all people, his belief in merit and character over status and wealth. Alistair Finch, the titan of industry, the man who never showed weakness, looked at the perfectly restored engine of his father's car, an engine tended to by his father's brilliant friend. He looked at Silas, whose face held no triumph, no I told you so, only a deep, abiding sadness. And, in the quiet, oil-scented air of the garage, Alistair Finch began to cry. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs. They were silent, wrenching tears of profound shame and loss. He cried for his father, whose memory he had so thoroughly dishonored. He cried for the man he had become, so far removed from the values his father had tried to instill in him. He cried for the connection he could have had, the stories he could have heard, had he not been blinded by his own towering ego and petty prejudices. He sank down onto the overturned crate he had scorned earlier, burying his face in his hands, his expensive suit forgotten. Silas stood there for a moment, then walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was a firm, steadying touch, a touch of forgiveness. He was very proud of you, Silas said quietly. He just worried you'd forget where you came from. He worried you'd value the polish more than the steel beneath it. Alistair looked up, his face streaked with tears. I am so sorry, he whispered, the words raw and broken. I am so sorry. He reached for his wallet again, but this time was for a different reason. He pulled out every bill he had and tried to press it into Silas's hand. Please, he said, this is not enough. Nothing is enough. Silas gently pushed his hand away. Keep your money, Alistair. The work is done. This one was for Arthur. He looked at the phantom, its obsidian paint gleaming under the work lights. Just do one thing for me. Learn to listen to it. He'd like that. Alistair stayed for another hour. He didn't talk about business or money. He asked Silas to tell him about his father, and Silas, his silence finally broken, spoke. He shared stories of late-night engineering debates, of laughter over seized-up engine parts, of a shared passion for things built with integrity and purpose. In the hallowed quiet of the garage, surrounded by the ghosts of honest work, Alistair began to piece back together the image of his father, not through the lens of memory, but through the eyes of the man who had understood him best. It was the beginning of a long overdue education. When he finally left, driving the Phantom himself, the engine didn't just purr. It sang a song of redemption, its rhythm a steady, quiet beat of a heart restored. True worth, is not measured by the shine on your possessions, but by the integrity of your character. It is not found in the echo of your own voice, but in the willingness to be silent and listen to the wisdom of others, especially those you are conditioned to overlook. Pride builds walls that only humility can tear down, and sometimes, the most powerful truths are revealed not in a shout, but in a respectful silence that holds a mirror up to our own soul. The world is full of hidden power and quiet dignity, often residing in the very people that privilege seeks to dismiss. If you believe in the quiet triumph of truth and the power of emotional justice, subscribe for more stories that challenge the powerful and champion the underestimated.